Is July 12th, just after 4 o'clock p.m., and this is a meeting of our policy committee, and appreciate your promptness to the meeting and apologize for my disrespectful tardiness getting here, but it is 4:05 and we are getting started. So let's introduce our policy committee. Is Board Member Paul Fisher, Board Member Chris Swigert, I'm Board Member Joel Ondert, and our superintendent is here tonight. We're recording the meeting as we always do. And Superintendent Wimmer, can you confirm the meeting was properly posted?
Yes, it was.
All right. And on our agenda tonight is policy reviews, several policy reviews focusing primarily on our 100 and 200 series. And with that, I will turn it over to the superintendent to get us started.
Was your agenda approved?
I suppose we do need to approve.
I would move to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
All right, thank you for that. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None? Great, we have an agenda. Thank you.
And I know our committee's been good about digging in for some hour blocks, so I give us enough cushion and we can work till we kind of see a natural break and get through what we need to. But if you want to start, just a reminder to our public, we're talking about a lot of stuff and pages of legal language. It's all found on our website, right under Board Docs. You can click on the meeting. You can see all the links to everything that the board is seeing. But for the first thing, we wanted to go through a potential calendar. When we last discussed, there's certain meetings for our board policy. It shows that we would have maybe 2 for an expedited review or 3 board action, times that it came before the board. So what I've done is, in that link for policy committee, it's just reorienting you. The first 2 slides show that the series are numbered. We use the WASB numbering conventions. Each series, the 100 series, 200 series, they have a different topic. And you can see I've got things listed there. And I'll come back to that. But if you go to number 4, just shows us, so what does that look like if we were to ensure in this year we do a full review and touch or talk about all policies, knowing that some policies take longer to dig into. We might have to take something out of order. So for example, open enrollment policy, we're always going to review that every December before the board acts on it. So knowing that, but this just is putting a cycle of review that's in attention to potentially coming before the full board at 3 meetings. And you can see those meetings listed. And we would chunk everything by series. And I'm mindfully taking the series out of order. We discussed this last time because we wouldn't want to be out for summer session and talking about instructional things when maybe families are on vacation, etc. So right now I've been leading with kind of some organizational things, how the board functions, etc. And then I'm also balancing some of those loads. And for example, the 500 series, that's about staff. And so there's different benefits committees. There's different groups that would convene around that in addition to just the policy committee. So it's giving enough time and communication for various groups in those. So that is how and we loosely talked about it at our first meeting around that. And then you'll see on there I've got kind of a general dot place when we would need to convene for a session as a committee in advance of the board digging into their end of things. And then also some items that should go before the curriculum committee. They predominantly are dealing with the 300 series, some of the 400 series, but mostly that would come through policy. That's the student service side of everything. So it really just, given the status of policies, I think it's good. The way we executed last time leads me to believe this is a really diligent group. Our board members read everything we put in front of them, so it might not be that we need changes or anything, but I think this group can at least put their eyes on these policies in the time frame of this year to attend to things. And again, we led with things that were required. So any discussion or kind of how this was developed based on?
Why don't we use our microphones to make sure our cameras pick up our volume tonight. The timeline looks great, slide number 4. Is this something that will have to happen every single year? Where in your previous district, did you look at every single policy every single year? Or is it every other year?
So in my last district, I was there for 6 years, and much like my first board meeting here, we were looking at one from 1972.
Yeah.
Same thing. It hadn't been attended to, but we took a much slower approach. And so we only took so many at each meeting, so we wouldn't exceed 10 policies because there was no committee structure. It was committee of the whole, so it was always full board all the time. So we were balancing it with other agendas, so it took years. So I'm saying, given our structure and the capacity of our board and how we move through it, that we're capable of putting our eyes on it, and then we would flip into a cycle of renewal
Great.
where we would just have a couple series we would look at each year, much like curriculum, probably every 3-year cycle, and then just tuning up the ones that have substantive legal changes or recommendations behind them.
Yeah, I'd be supportive of that approach. I think the idea of certain policies we'll need to look at, like you said, every year.
Mhm.
So we can maybe call those the ones that require annual review, and then after that, to say, is it in every other year, every third year, every fourth year?
Mhm.
I would imagine it depends. There are some policies that probably are very, very unlikely to change, and there are ones, and so I like the approach of some sort of cadence.
Perfect, and we can look through, what I can do is I can set a supplementary cycle, so once we get through this year, what do the next 3 years look like? Parsing those out, and then just put some kind of swing areas of, being in attention to relevant policies of the time to pick up changes, so we can see it in context.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that if there is a law that changes, and this is, I would assume, part of the benefit of the WASB subscription is that they would notify us, or internal staff would be monitoring it, that maybe there's a policy that would require some revisions. Maybe it's not on cycle to be reviewed, but it should be taken. I would assume that's part of the process as well.
Correct, so while we're saying 600, 700s nested in there, I might have a 300, but we know that we're convening consistently to take care of that. And I think that we can always balance the load of how many of we're gonna dig into. We can prioritize just as we did last time, so I think we've got it in a manner that'll be responsive to the needs of the district, and keeping in a manner where we want to make sure that we're doing all of our work publicly and engaging various groups when able to.
Great.
So that look good?
You bet.
All right. Then, without further ado, I had set the 100 and 200 series. I think it was really well received and easy to follow along, especially for our board members who weren't part of the policy committee per se. To look at if you follow along with that policy document. Again, for everyone who's watching, it's linked right in board docs, and it's just kind of a dashboard, if you will, of all of our policies. Those are all publicly posted on our website as well, but this is just helping you to monitor the work. You can see that today's committee meeting 7/12/21 has its own tab, and we have, you'll recall that each series is numbered, so the 100 is board operations, then nested under that, the 130 portion is legal status. So the 110s, which we don't have any 110s, would be around our own mission and things of that nature. So there's always in the coding system, so I'll go through and highlight a couple, because if there's something that you want us to investigate and say, oh, what does that look like, or who has that, or what does WASB say about that, we'll go through. So in the 110s, you're looking at district mission, goals, strategic planning, continuous improvement. We do not have any policies in that domain. It usually simply states the district mission, or it might say that, when it comes to continuous improvement, we're going to bring it before the board annually, that kind of thing. It sets those. So while we do have a mission statement and all those pieces, we do not have anything formally in there. Our first under that heading would be the 113, which was non-discrimination in district programs. It's the very first one on that dashboard, if you will. There is no link. We don't have it currently in policy. It is a required policy, and I've given you some draft language. This is based on previously what we reviewed, because it was required, was a very lengthy document from WASB. And at the time, it was kind of go check what other districts are doing, see what the language looks like, see where we can tighten this up, and bring it back for discussion. So that's what you see before us today. Our team, even though we don't have the policy formally in place, we have a workflow process. Everyone has to be formally trained in the new Title IX components, all of those things. All that training occurred. And this is just utilizing their standard language that's in compliance with the new requirements, and then showing that it's really predominantly our Director of Human Resources, Director of People Services, myself, the Office of the Superintendent, who are largely responsible for taking in any kind of complaints or understanding if there's any nuance to a situation that we're navigating, if there's any implications for discrimination, that we would need to utilize this process. So that is the language. Again, we've looked at it a little bit before. There wasn't too many places to tighten. So I'll let you absorb that, take a look at it, and let me know your thoughts.
It's long, but it did come from WASB, and it's 7 pages, but page 7 is all references to federal laws and Wisconsin code and statutes. And if there's not much to tighten up there, then there's nothing we can do about having a long policy, but we have to have it, so.
No, what I appreciate is in the very beginning, it talks about discrimination, what's meant by that, but the term is unlawful discrimination. And I think that's really important, for folks to remember that we're talking about discrimination that the law does not allow. And so I think in many ways, you could look at it and say, really, we have to state this? But the answer is yes, it's mandated. And the idea that we're saying, yeah, we're not going to allow discrimination that is unlawful, I think actually kind of contains it nicely. So I took a look at it, I thought it was worded fine, and it sure looks like it meets the requirements of the mandate.
And I think the other thing that you as a committee expressed prior, anytime something gets this lengthy, you worry about fidelity to it, making sure that the system's there. But there's, given, again, the federal and state requirements that we have to follow in this area, we have flowcharts, checklists, and specific trainings that we have to get certified in every year, multiple positions in the district. So we're really confident in its execution and practice.
So are we okay to bring that one to the full board? I assume that's kind of what we're getting at tonight with all of these.
Yep.
Our next step on all of them is bringing it to the board
Yeah,
for first reading.
I'm supportive of advancing it for first reading.
Sure.
Agreed.
Agreed, Paul? Great.
And
I
if-
as well.
People are following along. I know the recording won't be in real time, but you'll see I'm just keeping notes from our discussion encapsulated right on that same document around what we're doing. Again, that's helping our own board and our staff, our families, and our community stay informed too.
Great.
The next one, we have 130, which is organization. In the 130 series, it's around the legal status of your school board. It's elections, filling vacancies. You'll recall that the 133 is required. But in the 130, you take a look at the current, it's very brief, and it's just saying who we are as an organization. So in the draft, I picked up the last paragraph from WASB and added that in if you take a look at it. And it's just talking about the board's duties and authority and the scope of serving those communities. So we can put something like that there. You don't have to put it, or it can be incorporated in some of the following. But I thought it was a nice fit in there. When I looked at the next kind of group of policies, we had some on the term of office, number of members, office and terms again, and the elections. So you can see, like, all right, that paragraph might expand understanding, but given none of these are required in the way they look, we have an opportunity to put some things together or not. So I just thought this was a natural fit to add that last paragraph.
And that's lines 12 through 17.
correct. It's just giving the, let me. Okay, there. It's specifically correct, lines 12 through 17, applicable law defining the scope of the board's duties. So it's saying, you know, we're a school board, here's who we serve, here's our, you know, our body that would be electing us, and then here's the scope of our duties, powers, and authority in that community. So
Towards,
again, the policy in all of these, outside of 133, nothing's required, mandated, or has implications for law. That's what those columns show. So we have a lot of flexibility of what we want to see, what's meaningful for our board. Because if you think about if you were welcoming a new board member, how do they know who we are, what we do, the scope of their responsibilities, or even to convey that to our community?
I'm wondering on the tail end of line 10, board members are public officials who are elected or appointed, yada, yada. Should we maybe make a reference to the policy that talks about elections?
Or you can add something about you can make it comprehensive, that's what I'm saying, you could put something in. So I would want to, if you want to say something about elected and you're trying to say, oh, there's more information found in I wouldn't name, I would just say, you know, see policies regarding election, but you can see they're up for kind of discussion too, as well. So you can nest it, there's opportunity here. So
Yeah.
you can see the next three, I was like, why do we have these, you know, 5-sentence each policies? What story are we trying to convey here?
Well, maybe with that backdrop, maybe we can hold a decision on this one until we look at those subsequent ones
Yeah,
and then
do we
maybe
wanna-
circle back. Would
Yeah,
that be
does
okay?
it say that? Or as I think Paul's getting at it, is letting them know there's more in other places. So if they came there as a first stop, maybe looking for something else, how to help them get to where they're really looking.
Well, and I'm fine with the less is more theory. If you've got a policy of 2 sentences on term and 2 sentences on number of members, let's just roll it into one and keep it simple.
Yeah, so if you want to take a look at the next ones that talked about the term, the number of members, like why do I need a policy of number of members? I mindfully said it in that last policy. We're a 7-member board. And I think I said it in another place. So it's like, do I need one that says I'm 7 members if I'm
I'm
somewhere
in
else?
favor of combining like 130.1 and 130.2 into 130, as long as the header or the name of the policy
Mhm.
is clear to someone going onto our website where they can see. If someone wants to know how many members are on the Westman School Board, they can see it in the title, number of members, you know what I mean? Then they know which one to click on.
Then I would say, take a
So-
look at the 131, and then let's retitle that.
School Board elections,
So, or make it comprehensive into 130, which is school board, you know, the legal status, and then in there you can say term, elections, you know, you can
Correct.
put those as headings. We can organize it however we want. So I mean, we could even consolidate it further, Paul, then we wouldn't have to do like you're saying, that we're still leading them somewhere else. Do we nest it under 130 and then have term of office, number of members, officers, have all?
Filling vacancies, even roll 133 in there, because that's in lieu of an election.
133 is required,
Okay.
right? So,
filling school board vacancies, okay?
I would just want to make sure I'm in attention to keeping a 133.
So in that case, then, you could make a reference to policy 133 specifically. But yeah, I would be in favor of rolling it all into organization, because that just talks about the structure of this body.
All right, so,
You're essentially getting rid of 130.1, 2, and 3 and combining it to 130.
so we're gonna move all concepts to 130 versus 131. And we're gonna make sure we're in attention to the language where we say who we're serving, 7-member board and authority, term of office, yep, at large is an important concept because some districts portion their seats for representation. Term of office, number of members, and then we had the officers. There's more than 140 on officers, and I feel like that should keep and stay segregated down to the 140 piece. And I'll speak to that, because 141 is really all about board officers.
Yep.
So this is more about general board. And there's no anything right now in our process. Some districts would require that before you can be on a ballot, you'd have to go get so many signatures in the community or things like that. I've not heard from anyone in our community, any concerns about the process. We don't have that extra step in there. I don't know that it's necessary to create that. Some do, where you have to have like 1,000 signatures before you can even process that next step, but, so I don't have any recommendation like that to keep it in alignment with. So we'd be looking at the 130, and then I would just kind of visually put term of organization, term of office, number of members, just those concepts, and keep that language right there tight, and then make the heading, to Joel's point, you know, school board, organization, and detail, you know, so a heading that leads you there for when you want that info. Anything else in the content of those, or anything that you want to make sure that we're including? I think I can kind of nest them back together in a visual way.
For me, not on 130.2, that one's pretty simple. That's just, we're a 7-member board.
Yeah, like I said, it was establishing who our community is and who we serve, the extent of the authority of a board, making sure that we were 7 members in there, that our seats were at large. There's no additional steps to wanting to file, that those are, 3-year terms, so that they understood that. And then we've added, like on our website, it says our board members and their terms and when they expire, so that's all publicly there, it's not nested in policy. It talks about taking the oath of office prior to being seated, that's all in statute around that 4th Monday. So it really gets at kind of all the pieces. And then, as we said, that 133 really digs into, by design, how to fill vacancies.
Looks good to me.
All right, I will consolidate
Looks
those,
good.
rename it as a 130, work the title a little bit more, and all concepts and content were good. The one thing when it came to the vacancies, we just looked at that, it's updated, it's recent. We have the 134 that sits outside of that, if the vacancy were due to military leave.
Is this a West Bend policy? It's not a requirement, I see.
Correct. This is something that we have now. This is talking about, active service, and because there's rules about, serving and being absent and those kinds of things. So we could leave it as a standalone, or you can consider it as part of a vacancy under 133, or we can make it its own area 133, or just leave it. So there's a lot of options for you.
What about deleting it altogether?
You can delete it.
And vacancies there's state statutes regarding vacancies and how they're caused and how they're filled. The second paragraph of that policy as it stands, I don't really even understand. Talks about completing 40 days of the federal service, a statement under oath. And I don't really even understand what it's trying to get at there.
I think it's digging into, 133. Do you think that covers you for vacancy for whatever purpose, inclusive of this?
Back to 133 here.
I mean, which it's on the board's authority to appoint someone as an interim in a vacancy.
I guess that's the way I would like to handle in the event we have a board member who leaves for military service is I would sure as heck hope the board would work with that individual to say, you know, look, we as a board, we know you're gonna be gone 6 months. We'd like to appoint an interim and, you know, knowing that you're gonna come back and you still have, say, 2 years left on your term, then the interim's gonna go from this point to that point that you return, and obviously you're gonna come back and fill your seat. I sure as heck would hope a board would handle it that way. To have a separate standalone policy, I don't know that you need to do that. I think people leaving for military service will wanna, it could be, they may elect to never come back to fill
I think
their
this might have
term, you
been,
know.
this might have been one of the cases where West Bend was maybe leading the way on something and had a policy on the books around vacancies. It's relatively new that we
I
were
see that.
required to have a policy in place around vacancies for school districts, and it's because some districts ran into issues, quite honestly, and they were providing guidance on how to do it because they were, you know, they had difficulty with process. So, you know, like you said, does 133 now naturally take care of that for you?
So 133 is required, but we still have flexibility to maybe meld this verbiage in, because I like the idea of calling out military leave specifically, because in my mind, the true sense of 133 is, I'm moving out of the district, I'm not coming back. This gives us that protocol for what happens when somebody returns. I would not want to do away with 134 entirely and not address military leave, because when we all
Sure.
win the lottery, go to Florida, and the next committee, or the next policy committee sitting here, nobody's gonna remember what happened. I would be okay rolling a subheading into 133 that specifically addresses military leave.
Okay. So then, looking at what's currently in place for 134 around leave, does that fit where we are now as a board? Because that's, again, that's a practice that you said a previous policy committee and board came up with. Does this align?
Not to drag us down to the detail, but I think I will.
Yeah.
Can we just walk through it a bit? So the way that 134 works, we have, if a school board member enters the armed forces, they're going to temporarily remove themselves from the district. That's the first thing that it says,
Yeah.
okay? Now, let's pause right there, because if that's the case, that means they've rendered themselves ineligible for service on the board because they've been removed from the district. This needs some work, I think.
I would say we would need to rewrite it, because what you're asking them is to formally say I'm not on the board, you know what I mean? To not just say, oh, they're absent in perpetuity, right? You're like, hey, can we make a formal declaration that you're gone? But like you said, you're not removing yourself from the district, you know, unless if they're changing their residency, but they're not changing their residency, they're just reporting for duty.
And I appreciate the point. I'm not trying to
I
dismantle
think
this.
it's written.
I think we could read it,
Yeah.
we could write it a bit more crisply, and it also talks about such vacancy will constitute a temporary vacancy and be filled according to the administrative rule for filling board vacancies. There isn't anything in the other that talked about temporary vacancy, because you talked, Joel, about can we appoint an interim? I guess I've never thought about that, if that's the right approach, if that's a legal approach or not. That's interesting, but there's nothing, I couldn't find anything that talked about a temporary vacancy in the other procedure unless I was missing something.
No, and do we want to look at, and maybe that's where the discussion is with us as a team, you know, and the board, is there a certain number of days where it's, okay, if someone's going to be called in for active duty, you're noticing the president, you're talking about what that projected leaves looks like, and it's, you know, because that could be a different span. It's very different if they're going for, you know, an extended duty that's going to be a couple months versus 2 years. So, you know, maybe we put something in there around that time if it's anticipated to be within this the board will operate, something beyond, the board needs to explore
Deployment
X, Y,
longer
and
than
Z.
6 months, something like that. Because, yeah, I mean, if you were, and I'm thinking when, you know, the 832nd gets deployed, they don't go for 6 months. It's typically a year at least. But if somebody is called up for a 6-month assignment, to go through getting nominations, reviewing, and the board appointing somebody, you're already probably 2 months into the process. They're just
Yeah.
getting up to speed. I would say it would need to be, you know, a deployment of more than 6 months would kind of be the threshold where we would consider moving forward with a temporary, an interim appointment.
Okay, so work with WASB to get some updated language around service, and then something that we could fold in mindfully into the 133 that calls out. Now, I'll devil in the details. 6-month absence only for military service?
Well, I'm just,
As opposed to,
I got relocated for my job for 6 months. My spouse got deployed, and I can't do what I could do because I have to be both, you know, mom and dad in household, and because if we don't write it down,
right,
it'll happen, so.
Well, and Joe, back to something that you were saying earlier, you know, I was looking at the main vacancy provision. And really, it looks like if the board wanted to keep that position open, they wouldn't have to fill it.
Correct.
I mean, so the board has that flexibility that if there's somebody who's deployed and we truly honestly think that person's gonna be back in a reasonable period of time, although there are certain votes that need to take place at certain days, the board doesn't need to fill the vacancy at all, technically. I think, that's how I read it. So
Correct.
I say that gives us some flexibility on the backside. But yeah, I think it makes sense to try to, let's see if we can stitch this together a little bit better to see if it
So
can fit together more gracefully.
work it into 133, look at it, make sure the board has that, especially things that we're saying are, you know, less than a year's, you know, 6-month service, that kind of piece, and marry that language.
I don't like the fact that 134, as it sits now, it's pretty mandatory. If you're being called for a service, you have to resign. But, you know, what if a National Guard member is called for hurricane cleanup for 3 months, or 3 weeks down in Florida, and they say, well, wait a minute, we've got a policy that says I can call in remotely. I don't want to resign my seat. I can call into a board meeting, or I'm gonna miss a meeting, but I don't want to lose my seat on the board. I'll be back in 3 weeks.
well,
you know?
so do we throw another time-bound parameter in here that deployments of more than 6 months would qualify for temporary leave from the board? And again, like Jen said, you know, the devil's in the details. You know, we've never had this opportunity, this situation. We're spending all this time on something that may never happen, but I agree that, you know, if it's not written down, then it's just kind of catch as catch can. But,
And I can consult with WASB around our intention is to try and honor those who are serving and create continuity in board service, and being mindful of, we know, as you said, Paul, what it takes to get someone in, acclimated and going. So how do we kind of honor everything and do what we need to do to remain? I'm sure they can help us look at that. But yeah, then it wouldn't be we'd be looking to remove the 134 and nesting some language inside 133 so people are really clear on that. So what I will do is, in the interim, have that conversation with WASB Legal, get some recommendations, and then send that for your review to look at it to see if that is good. But if we can get that kind of, as you said, stitched together in a better way, then bring that forward to remove 134 and bring it up with a 133 revision.
Good.
Sounds excellent. So in that next series, 140, that's officers, auxiliary personnel of the district. So that's talking about officers, any kind of consultants, representatives to the board, that kind of thing. So you can see we had 141, and as we said, some of those, that 130 section started bleeding into officers. when really there's a 141, which is officers and their duties. So if you look at our current one, and Chris and I ran into it this year when I was navigating, when we were going over officers, I'm like, sure, we say what they are, and we say what the roles are, but you don't tell me how do they get there in that policy. So you told me the duties, but we would want to look for, especially where I watched a board meeting, someone else's board meeting, not ours. They did not know what they were doing, and there they are in front of the community going, well, do I nominate? Do you nominate? What are we doing? You know, we want to make that really clear. So you saw this spring, what Chris and I did was we launched with, remember, here's all our rules. Everyone look at it. You've been sitting in these different roles. Are they accurate? No one, when we asked that question, brought back like, hey, this is kind of written wrong, or we should clean this up, you know, so there was no feedback. And then we looked at some other places in statute that helped guide us towards process. And what I did was I looked at, WASB's got all sorts of multi-page legal samples, and in my previous life, I untangled that once before. So I gave you my prior district sample, and it talks about the duties, but the whole kind of preamble, if you will, to that was the election, when it's held, how they're elected, what order, and then this is the one case where you can vote as a board by secret ballot, and the only case in which you can do that. And so what you do is you look at who's interested in the roles, and then what kind of election are you gonna have to do that.
So we don't have a policy on election of officers.
You have the duties, and you have, it should just all be together right here.
I mean, in the absence of a policy, I think it's, you know, defaults to
Statute.
something statute, Robert's Rules of Order, that type, but I agree, having it laid out, I think is just good practice, because we're gonna have new school board members from time to time, and so from an orientation perspective, I think it's important, so we all agree, all right, this is how it's going to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see in my former district, we wrote, it's just based on, I used WASB there as well, and it was just a brief preamble regarding process.
I think the Mapledale example is good.
It's WASB's example, that's what we
WASB.
use, yeah, we use the
And then
same
you go
thing.
down to the duties at the bottom.
Mhm.
I'm with you, when it comes time to elect officers, I never thought you had to nominate positions.
Mhm.
So, you know, I kind of remember years ago, I don't know, my first year on the board, I don't think we nominated, because you can nominate yourself if you.
Sure, and you
if
still
want
can in this
to.
model.
And then having the person needs to accept the nomination, obviously, if they don't want to do it, they would say, I don't want to do it. But then they get a second, I didn't know that, do we need to get a second? Or, hey, I nominate you, do you accept? Yeah, great. So whatever the process should be, WASB will tell us, and maybe it's in your Mapledale, I didn't read the whole thing.
That was
but,
pretty brief.
um,
It gave us enough flexibility in there saying these are all the ways we could do it. And then we determined based on who was, how many people were going for what position would be uncomfortable, if people were having to kind of choose sides, because you do have that. We did not have that this spring. Everyone chose to continue forward in the roles that they are, but I mean, in some places you might have people competing for a nomination
Yeah.
or for an office, so.
And that is in the Mapledale,
Yep, it gave us secret ballot, roll call vote, sign ballot, or voice vote are your options.
oh, here it is,
And
yeah.
we determined, they all have to go in order, but we determined by who was going for what position, and I've done secret ballot before, and I've done just voice. So anytime we had a contested officer position, we went to ballot.
It is good actually to also call out the order in which they're going to be elected. Do you start from, not that there's, a bottom and a top, so to speak, but what order, who goes first, who goes second?
That was another thing that I had seen, like you said, in that other board meeting where they didn't see the process all the way through. So all of a sudden they had all these competing nominations. They were like nominating the whole slate. And it's like, no, you first get through this one, then you do this one. that kind of thing, because you don't know who's gonna get elected for what.
Right.
So I just like to avoid,
Clarity.
exactly.
No, I think that's good because yeah, it's often that's going to be a meeting where there could be new members.
Yeah. And you want to be able to, welcome your new members, go through this policy together to talk about the different offices, the ability, just as we did this year, even though we didn't have anyone new, we did the same thing that we would do normally, which is opportunity to review the descriptions of each one now and express interest to either the board president, myself, so that we could craft future board agendas and process. But we kind of said, like, here's the parameters in which we're going to do that.
I don't know that our treasurer signs checks. Is that something our treasurer does?
You submit your signatures and technically your,
Okay, at the end, when we approve something, that's what we're
The
doing.
fact-
Signatories are
yeah,
out.
Yeah.
we don't cut a lot of checks, but.
Yeah.
And then like make arrangements to sue for all monies due the district. Is that,
Well, there's some things around legal, so if you look at the Mapledale one, those duties, those are actually the legal ones as defined by WASB.
okay,
The ones in ours, I think, are a mix of what we had been doing in those roles, so if you wanna take a minute and look at those are as defined by legal guidance, those duties would be. But the treasurer does, you're authorizing us
right.
to do, like, if we have to sue or do something like that, and monies, or if I'm going to collections, we're working with different groups to authorize us to do that.
I would imagine that make arrangements to sue for all monies through the district means that making arrangements could be having the administration take care of it.
Correct.
In addition, I suppose it's also possible that, once in a while, if you have lawsuit papers and somebody needs to sign them and you need to make sure that there's someone that's authorized, that you'd have the treasurer who is authorized by this policy to sign the paperwork. Because my guess is, and I guess we haven't talked a lot about collections actions here. I don't know if there are many of them, so.
No, not too many. I think the largest collections, not necessarily monetary, but impact would be around fees or lunch. And lunches have been through, federal subsidies, free for the last year. They'll be free coming into this year, so that's gone away. But I don't see evidence of us going to collections for outstanding fees that are sometimes total, they're in the thousands.
As long as these duties that I'm reading with the Mapledale example are all duties that can be delegated to the district or administration, then I'm fine with it. Because, like under the clerk, it says, administer the oath of office to newly elected and appointed board members. When Deb Wrench was here, she often administered that oath of office.
Erin came and did it this year.
Who did?
Erin did it.
Did it, okay.
Yeah, she did do it.
But if Erin wasn't available to meet the deadline of when people need to be sworn in.
But that's the nuance, that's why some of these things, as you said, Joel, are so weird, because you do and don't do those things. Also by statute, you can go to anyone, you can go to a local bank, anyone who's a notary is authorized to give you that oath.
Mhm.
So it doesn't even need to be in-house or by that person, you're making those arrangements. So like you said, maybe, in the scope of that role, their work includes, but they're not the ones responsible. So some better language around there.
No, I don't know that we need better language. I'm fine with that as long as.
Well, take a look, we're just saying, we know we need a preamble to ours.
Yeah,
And then everything else, what we're saying as far as the roles, like I asked mindfully this spring to see if there was any recommendations for cleanup, I didn't get any feedback. So just adding a preamble and keeping everything we have?
I'm fine with keeping what we have, because I think ours is nice and short and sweet, and then we've got state statutes referring to it, but I do like the preamble for the
Okay.
Mapledale example.
Alright, I'm just gonna add the preamble, which is just that standard WASB language. I'll add those, those first three, and then, I'll just say general duties, you know, of each role include, kind of thing, to lead you into those.
Sounds good.
Paul, Chris, okay with that? I mean,
Yes.
kind of keep our descriptions with that
Mhm.
preamble and.
Yes, sounds good.
All right, so you use the preamble. I'm just gonna say Joel Unger has to use the oath of office.
Yeah,
every
right.
time.
I'm not a notary, so.
All the time. I once went to a bank to get something notarized, and I kid you not, I looked down at the notary's signature after I signed it. Jennifer Wimmer, it was the same name. I was like, that just looks weird.
That's funny.
I was like, are they gonna buy this? Like, I don't remember when I was getting notarized, but I was like, that
That's
is,
funny.
how weird is that? Next, 143 is around consultants to the district. So not required, I'm not sure, you know, I'm sure there's a reason that this was here, but.
I'm not opposed to this. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what if we needed an interim, you know, assistant superintendent of something?
Mhm.
And is there ever a circumstance where we would have a contracted employee to do that? And would they be considered a consultant? Because if that's the case, we say, consultants shall exercise no administrative authority over the work of employees in the district. Well, they would have to if there's the assistant superintendent, or would we never do?
Right now,
that?
I have someone, and it's how do you define consultant?
Exactly.
Right.
And I put that in the notes later when it comes to what's an ad hoc committee, what's a this, like, help me understand what that means. Because right now, we have an interim athletic director for East Middle School, and you bet we've given him the authority to do what he needs to do and hire and screen applicants and serve in that manner, so.
Right, and so I don't mind this policy, but I think we would need to just clarify what is a consultant, because I would hate to have us interfere with the circumstances we just described.
Is it necessary?
Well, that's a good point.
I don't know that the policy is necessary. It doesn't say that the school board has to approve bringing in a consultant. And so there's really no authority on who makes the decision when to bring a consultant in or not.
This reads like maybe there's a history that all of us aren't aware, but this is from 1970.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's valid. It's reading to me like you're assuring your employees that an outside person isn't the boss of you. That's what it reads as to me. I don't see the need.
But again, if you're gonna bring in somebody from the outside for a 6-month term, or this year, they've got an operation to run, they are going to have administrative responsibility. And I guess from a verbiage perspective, you could say, well, if they're tagged as an interim, then they have that ability. Otherwise, consultant, to me, implies this is short term, 20 hours a week, 40 hours for 3 weeks, and then you go away type of thing, but now you're splitting hairs.
But that, like I said, that's not a shared definition of consultant, right? That's part-time or interim employment. This is just giving, so a consultant, we're having someone independently audit all the athletic fields, spaces and all that in the whole district. Well, they don't have authority to do anything, but that's in your agreements. When you're looking at scope of work, all of that. So when I think consultant, I'm thinking more agency rather than independent, a person that I'm hiring to do something. But no matter what, there's a scope of work involved, and there's agreements, and there's articulation around that in the hiring process. So I just don't know.
And sometimes that scope will be administrative authority, based on what you need. So
Right.
again, is this necessary, or do we leave it to the discretion of the hiring manager, whether it's, somebody at the high school or building principal, super, whatever?
I questioned if it was necessary.
Yeah.
I recommend taking it off.
Yeah, after hearing this discussion, I'd recommend we recommend deletion.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
I just think there's plenty of other places to be mindful. I understand the intent, but the intent is older than me. So I can do the math, this is 50 years old,
Yeah.
which I'm Like I said, it is older than me. So we're gonna recommend removal. The next one is 150, and that is looking at, in the 150s, it's school board governance, and it's around your policy adoption and review, any legislative program or legislative advocacy that you might have, things of that nature. So on the books in this area, we have pieces around legal responsibilities and policies. So if you want to take a look at 150, which is our current. That's just talking about the general, I would minimally, it's rename it, it should be school board governance, is the name of that intended policy. But we also talked about that, if we bring forward those other recommendations, we talk about the scope and authority of a board with that new paragraph in that other policy. I recall, I think it was 130. So is this really necessary here? So then I brought forward WASB language in the 150 where it's setting the scope of governance and talking about maybe some core practices in the scope of that governance. So again, not required. The current one as it read kind of looks like we pushed the content into 130. So
What's in the draft is WASB's standard?
WASB, yep. So, and WASB looks at, and they're just saying, from a governance perspective, you're a policy-making entity, here's what you're serving, but here's some things that you're, the scope of that work, here's some highlights.
Yeah.
So again, not required in any way. So
Okay.
this is really up to the team on what you want to see, if anything.
So the point at which, we bring this verbiage into alignment with our standards, and I've seen, in these policies going by here, I've seen reference to superintendent, and now here on line 17, district administrator. So you'll clean that up and
Yep. So
apply
there's
our
a couple
taxonomy?
things, that WASB would use that we don't. So they would use district administrator. There's technically no such thing in Wisconsin as a superintendent. We're all licensed as district administrators. So we're using the word on that, and then whether or not you use the word school board or board of education, that's another one of those nuances. So not knowing where we were gonna take it concept-wise, sometimes we just roll the language forward and let you look at it.
So
That's what we want.
do we use district administrator as our standard or
We
superintendent?
use superintendent here as our standard.
Should we fall in line with state standard, or is that potato?
Potato, potato.
Okay.
It's only around the uniqueness of our licensure, so they're always just gonna err toward the name of the specific license we hold is district administrator. We don't refer to ourselves as that. Our community wouldn't think of us as the district, who's the superintendent?
Yeah.
So I think it's actually plainer language for our community. But it's really, knowing that this one, I didn't quite know where the team wanted to take it, what you wanted to see, because again, not required. What we had currently written, I think we did a nice job with that one addition of that paragraph, that ending paragraph, those lines 12 through 17 and 130, to talk about the scope of the authority. So it's really up to you guys.
I like the WASB version better than our current version. I don't know that we need to list out 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8. And I especially like the 1, 2, 3, the third paragraph on the WASB example, talking about how the authority of the board rests with the board as a corporate body, and that not one individual member of the board possesses really any power unless acting on, acting as a board.
And we get into that in 160 a little bit too, around individual members and when you're representing the board, when you're yourself and all of that. So keep that in mind, because you're saying, hey, we need that concept of we're an organization.
I'm kind of in favor of deleting this policy. I don't know that it really even says anything other than the board's got, you know, the power to oversee the district.
Yeah, as required and outlined by state statutes.
With state law.
State gives us, so.
So 1:30, and then I'm gonna make a note and include, board as a group concept, board as a group.
Let me open
Concept.
160, you said,
Yeah, I wanna say it's coming up in 160,
161 maybe.
yeah. The individual members, one.
Yep, it is.
Collectively.
So yeah, I mean, I'm really comfortable with removing it. You've attended to the concepts that you felt were valuable in 2 other places.
Good. You guys okay with that?
Yes, agreed.
Yes,
Great.
less is more.
Less is more.
That's the thing. 150.1, that was just another kind of homegrown piece around different responsibilities of the board. Again, if we're removing that, is this necessary? Is it, you know, can we put it back up in what it means to be a board member in one of those other policies? If there's something in here that you find catching your eye or you want to make sure we include somewhere, there's plenty of spots to nest it in, I think.
Last reviewed 15 years ago,
We lean on this one heavily.
apparently, and adopted in 1960. I say strike it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, I looked at this and thought, well, maybe there's, you know, one of these A through J where there's something that's a little bit different that the public would say, oh, I wouldn't have known that that's in the school district's, you know, responsibility. They're all
They're all.
to carry out the laws, well, that's a good one. Supervise the schools, pay the bills. So, although I agree that these are all responsibilities, I don't think it adds anything or is terribly informative.
No, I agree.
Agreed. You have what's important to you and where the board's priority are in other places. It's not like you're getting rid of everything.
So recommend we delete that one too?
Yep.
Okay. Great.
151, so we have 2 pieces on the books with this. This is an AR that we kept, because that AR, you'll remember our very first policy conversation together, we talked about this process. We reviewed this policy, and we reviewed the AR. This is where everyone learned what an Oxford comma was. Your favorite. So we did review it. It hasn't been updated, but in there, just, you know, it met our needs for what we were doing, the work we were doing. But if you want to take a look now at the opportunity to really shift something, I did include WASB sample language in there. The only nuances are around, generally it's, the concepts were 2 readings. In other, we have a 3 reading, but we have a fast track option. So you always want to make sure there's some leniency in some of the WASB language, they had in there, you know, you can present and vote if you needed to, like how to set aside something and do that if you needed to. I was really hard pressed to find an instance where I need to give you something that day, and, you know, if something were that big, our board has been so responsive, we would just call a special meeting so that we were doing due diligence on something. I could not think of any circumstance where I needed to present it to you and have you immediately vote. So it was really around the timing and the cycle, you know, are you good with 3 times in front of the board with an option to fast track? How policy can come to be. So in some of them, it talks about, in ours, it talks specifically around student groups, civic groups, and others. So in some of the other language, they would say, shall be submitted in writing to the board policy committee or designee. You know, we don't have in there that it has to be in writing. So I was just kind of going through it, like, what are the concepts that we need to be in attention to?
I guess on this particular policy, I'd look to you for any recommended changes. I'm used to this policy the way that it is, and
So I liked, I would recommend a couple of things. And this is what was funny, and this is a throwback for their other consultant. What caught my eye in there, proposals regarding school district policy can originate from several sources: parent, taxpayer, employee organization, student organization, superintendent, a consultant, and a civic group. I'm like, a consultant? Like, when would a consultant, but a consultant could recommend, like,
Your auditor.
yeah, exactly, they're recommending that, so it was like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. So the only changes are, I would get rid of track changes in Microsoft Word. Just, we'll do a markup, standard markup, but.
Yeah, because you might use what's the Google equivalent of Word, right? And then we're in violation of a policy.
Exactly.
Silly, yeah.
So it was just using kind of a markup format. And then under publicly available, I would just note that all current policies will be made available on the district website, period. Because this is saying it's gotta be in Adobe, it's gotta be no, we're looking to switch into Word docs as we
Right.
move through this process, so.
Right. No, I think that makes sense, not to necessarily rely on a specific technology, otherwise you're somewhat handcuffed. On that policy on line, let's see, 5960, district will maintain a digital archive of all approved policies, et cetera, to ensure easy and ready access to prior versions of policies. And I have no problem with that, but is there some sort of document retention? I mean, can you find a policy from 75 years ago there?
Sure, so we're still following.
Apparently. No, just wanted to be sure. I mean, does that mean we're gonna keep it there forever? Because that's an awfully long time. And if that's the requirement, I don't know the answer to that.
No, I thought that caught my eye as a little bit unusual, what they state. I mean, we do keep things, we archive things and we keep them. I liked, it was in the sample language where they had it called out. Now, in there they had suspension of, how to suspend a policy, we know how to do that. Policy maintenance and dissemination. Board policies adopted for inclusion shall be systematically coded, should be further disseminated, but it delegates to the district administrator authority and discretion to maintain cross-reference plans, related policies, legal references, and adopted revision date histories that are relevant. So, it's delegating to that, and we would follow. DPI has a whole matrix of what kind of record is it and how long you have to keep it. So you could do something like that around following, established process by statute, Department of Public Instruction, that kind of thing.
So when a policy is superseded and goes into that archive, is there some watermark that goes on there that says this has been superseded, or visual indicator that this is no longer the active policy?
We wouldn't have that public facing anymore. It would be archived by us. So someone would have to act like, oh, what did that look like before? Did you ever have a policy on XYZ? And we'd have to go into an archive and look.
Okay.
But even now, with the way technology is, we keep the iterations of. So we'll keep this one and we'll get it archived, and then when we change the one word, then that one will become new, but we'll always put forward facing the most relevant, and anything that's been sunset, we would not have publicly. It would just create confusion for people. So do you want me to clean up that a little bit to put those parameters on timeline?
Agreed.
Okay. And then those little changes that I recommended were okay?
it mentions Microsoft again in the AR.
Yep.
Track changes in Microsoft Word, and I think, I don't know, the
So-
AR is obviously up to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so the AR, once we kind of fall with policy, then I would clean up that, I would just put, that kind of the committee would establish a cycle of renewal, but it doesn't have to be in order, and I would clean up references to software. And when I clean that up, then based on what we're doing here, then I'll, I'll change the R and bring it forward. Like I said, even though that's an administrative thing, I'd still like to show you the context.
Sounds good.
Anything else with policy that you felt like you had to get in there? How policies get to the committee, or how they're voted on, the cycle of them, suspending policies,
So
how you adopt, revise?
the way it reads with how, anybody can really bring a policy,
Yep.
a parent, a student, or whatever, and it talks about it needs to be submitted to the committee chairperson, and the chairperson will consult with the superintendent. And the way I read it, you do kind of need to bring it to the policy committee.
Mhm.
You can't just tell the parent thanks but no thanks. Do we want to change that? Do we want to say that the superintendent, the policy committee chairperson, they set the agenda and it's up to them whether or not they're going to even bring it to the committee? Because again, the way I read it now, it should be brought to the committee. But it also doesn't talk about how it then absolutely needs to go to the board. So a parent could bring a policy, we could review it and say, at that point, say thanks but no thanks, we're not going to bring it to the full board. And I'm okay with that but I think depending on, there's quite a bit of things going around with policies on the critical race theory. A parent could bring in a policy and say, I want this policy in place. We review it and say no. The parent might get upset that it's not going to go to the full board, but there's nothing in our policy that says that it has to.
Yeah,
And I'm okay with that.
I agree, I'm okay with that as well. The committee exists for a reason, and I would say we exist to exercise our judgment and discretion, and we act as a bit of a gatekeeper. And, if a member of the public would bring forward a policy like that and would be dissatisfied that it didn't come out of committee, their remedy is to do, if they wanted to, they can publicly appear in front of the board. I mean, so it's not like we're foreclosing it, but if truly this committee would believe that a policy that's brought forth is just incompatible with the district's values and judgment, I think we have the authority to stop it here. But again, they have a remedy to go to the full board, so I'm okay with that.
That's right, and I think we have policy that talks about how the president of the board and the superintendent set our agenda.
Yes.
So if that person showed up and, let's say Erin Dove, who's not on the committee, she also has a process where she can request that a topic be brought to the board. We have a policy on that.
Right.
Not only do we have a policy, but the agenda has that space every single month, that when we talk about that upcoming, we're soliciting in that moment. Is there
Future
something
agenda items.
from the board, so.
The other piece that you were asking, Joel, in the draft, the back end of line 15, the chairman of the policy committee implied will consult with the superintendent and shall introduce the proposal to the board policy committee for review. As policy chair, that takes the burden off of you to be the gatekeeper and share the responsibility with everybody, and at the same time, our collective input goes towards whatever the proposal is. And I like the fact that it's not black and white in terms of the community member must submit it in writing. They're talking with the chair, and the chair can certainly say, hey, I like where you're going with this, or there's a lot of detail here, can you send me an email and give it to me in a bit more structure, but deal with that, again, on an ad hoc basis.
Or connect with our superintendent, have a conversation, figure out, and then bring that forward.
But I like the fact that it shall be brought to this committee, and then the committee can decide to advance or table.
I'm with you.
Agreed.
Sounds good, so just those little things to clean up the AR to match.
I'm sorry, I think, Superintendent, you discussed this earlier. In fact, we began this meeting with the slides. I talked about the schedule and the cadence and such. I think you talked about this, I apologize, but in the AR, the policy review schedule, it says accordingly the following cycle is planned. would you leave that in there, or you,
No,
I think you
I
said,
would
well,
just say that we would set a cycle for review, right? And I wouldn't,
that's right,
I wouldn't say exactly which numbers then, but that we would have an agreed upon.
that we will
Yeah.
have one. Yeah.
And the committee would, because we might need to revisit it,
Mhm.
that shouldn't be in policy. We want to be more responsive than that, in my mind.
Great, thanks.
The only other thing, I saw some language that caught my eye in WASB around making policy. It just talked about the board's authority in that, that's the sole, this is your primary method of governing. And I like that it's the responsibility of the board and kind of things like that. And we have that a little bit as kind of that, as we say, the preamble to the policy around the responsibility of that. So those were the things when I was looking at policy, like I said, kind of striking out our current that didn't make sense to me, and things that were catching my eye in updated language were just around the responsibility of the board in that. What I need for 151, any other? Pieces? Okay. That would be the AR then as well.
Actually, maybe I can just ask one final question. I think it's fine that we divide it. Would we need an AR on this? I mean, could we, it would make for a long policy, but,
So the AR are all those internal
yeah.
functioning pieces.
Mhm.
I don't know that they need to be forward-facing at all, it's just how you do it. It was good to have a conversation at the outset of policy as a team around those and making sure we had shared understanding and continuity, because you can see where different teams come in and things get changed. So in this one case, I didn't feel like it's not something that we're gonna be changing how we write it all the time. But I thought for, my secretary was new last year, I'm a new superintendent, it was kind of nice to have that, because I had to ask those questions. What do we call ourselves? Are we Board of Education, or are we school board? Am I this, or is it that? There's some nuances in there that I thought were helpful. 160 then. 160 is about board members, and it's your authority as a board. We put some of that together. Board development, compensation, expenses, those kinds of things. So that's in the 160 series. It's around conduct and ethics, conflict of interest, electronic communications. Those are all in WASB, kind of what's out there. So you can see we've curated what we have, and I added one that we don't have that I'd like you to take a look at. So let's start with 161, and that is, as we said, that authority. And I said, minimally we need to revise the title and look at those pieces. But how much or how little you want to say in this series is again up to you. But certainly in a 161, we can say as little as we currently do.
Yeah.
Or you can say as much as WASB says. So I gave you the gamut to look at.
I love the fact that ours is so short, but WASB does have a lot of good information, and.
Well, what are the concepts that you like in that one, and can we make it short and sweet, but pluck some of the concepts that we like?
Joel, I agree with you. I thought that, I like the shortness and sweetness of the original. The WASB version is really kind of a good, complete instruction manual, but I looked at it and thought, if we could just take each one of those paragraphs and reduce it down to like 1 or 2 sentences, possibly one, I think we might be there, really. Because really we talk about the board member authority, which is we only have authority as a collective, not individually. The authority to make statements on behalf of the board and district, which is pretty much don't do that.
Right.
and complaints, make sure it gets forwarded to the superintendent.
And we do have complaint policies now.
That's also true.
So
Right.
that section, I don't know that it even needs to be in there as far as
That's a good
complaints.
That's a good point.
Well, remember, you're also, don't forget, you're a high-functioning board right now.
Right.
And I can point to a lot of other places that aren't. And what do you need if you have to help orient new board members to how you behave? This is a behavior piece.
Right.
This isn't how, but, because you're gonna be engaged with your constituents as board members. So how do you know what to do with a complaint when you receive it? And how do they know that you're following it? And how do we make sure that you're not acting out of your lane, kind of thing?
And that's kind of why I like the WASB version, although long.
Well, and I'm not opposed to keeping the WASB version as it is. I mean, it is a complete instruction manual, but I just wonder if there aren't opportunities to tighten up a few things here or there. So
Well,
almost kind of a
let me-
compromise.
Let me take a kick at that, Ken. So I'm gonna look at shortening WASB language, right? But keeping the key concepts in it.
Well, and for instance, starting on line 50, disclosure of legally protected or otherwise confidential or sensitive district information. That's important. I question, why is that in board member authority? I don't, so we could keep it there, which is fine. It could be a separate policy, I'm not sure. I just thought
Well,
that in a good way, that shows the completeness of this WASB
Yeah.
policy. And
And do we just retitle it like we did with the other and kind of like, hey, here's some big ideas around that? Tighten up all the language and make the title a little bit more nuanced
yeah.
to fit.
And if we could be presented with that summarized version and the original here, because
Mhm.
maybe we'll default back to the original, but I think it would be good to see one that's maybe a little bit tightened up.
Okay. I will put that together for you. The next one's, same thing, and it almost reminded me of that 130 series, right? Where we were taking all these concepts and we had these couple one-liners. So the next one's two pieces around board member development and opportunities, and that's your own. Right now, you've got in there just some general and some things about expenses. The WASB language, when it looks at specifically, it's named board member development opportunities, same thing, but it talks about, getting access to professional development and then some of the expenses, and following the rules of the district on those expenses. And it also, was it in this one or another one that talks about kind of expected travel and expenses? And then anything out of state, it's just aligning to practice. So you might be able to even, make a comprehensive policy out of the 163, 163.1, 164, all of those.
So I was curious your view on this. Our policy says that these aren't numbered lines, but I think it's the 6th line, 5th line. The board shall pay any attendance fee and shall reimburse attending board members for travel outside of the district. There are no real approval requirements. It doesn't require the approval of the board, nothing. What I like about the WASB one is, I believe it's starting at line 10, it says upon the submission of requests, et cetera, the district administrator may, within applicable budgetary constraints, authorize it. And I thought that was a key thing, because otherwise, technically, the way this works is if I wanted to attend a $25,000 seminar,
No.
well, no, I agree, but technically this says we're gonna reimburse it, why not?
Right. Well, that's not even my favorite part. It comes up a little bit later. I've never seen in here where we give you a daily rate as board members either. For loss of wages.
State of the district.
I'm like, wow, I've never seen, there's a lot, yeah. So I'm coming for that, that's in one of the next ones. But no, agreed, I thought it didn't have a lot of parameters. I thought the WASB one, and we can even talk further about it, like what are some expected things? And then there's things that we budget for on your behalf for your own development and your memberships for WASB and things of that nature. So And then it got more into the expense side, and you gotta follow the district protocols. Anything of our current one that you really love and want to make sure gets carried forward?
Well, 164 talks about that daily rate and mileage.
Yeah, I thought there were some redundancies around expense reimbursement.
Are you proposing that we don't put a daily rate of loss of earnings, or?
I thought that was unusual, I've never seen anything
Yeah,
like
it
that.
started in 1965. So that would be one I would just get rid of. 163.1 just is a one sentence talking about membership fees to state and national organizations. That could certainly be combined into
I put it in your
something else.
learning, that's part of your professional networking and learning.
Mhm.
And Joe, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I guess 163.1 would go into just the regular 163, whether we use our current one or the WASB one.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Go back here.
So I'm gonna include the concept of memberships, dues, reimbursements, pre-approvals.
Out of morbid curiosity, on 164 as it exists, that's the whole reimburse not to exceed $100 a day.
Uh-huh,
The final sentence of the first paragraph says, such payments shall be made within this policy only if authorized by the annual or special common school district meeting. I asked that question, just want to be sure we haven't missed anything, because that is a bit odd. So not like a regular meeting? Am I missing something there?
no.
Okay,
I think it's establishing the rate. I think what its intention is doing, just as you would establish at the annual meeting other rates or things, I think it's making that go very public. But again, it's a holdover from,
okay, that makes sense.
so
I'm good.
it's not that you wait once a year to get reimbursed. I think it's saying that daily rate and the concept of reimbursement has to come before that annual meeting.
I see. Thanks.
So really, the one that talks about, it's 164 is the official policy, board member compensation and expenses. So I think we should tailor anything towards compensation and how you go about reimbursement of expenses solidly there. And then the whole memberships, dues, pre-approval as part of your professional practice, networking, we drive to the upper. Get rid of the whole daily rate one. And then I'm just looking at so it's the salaries are established,
164.1.
yeah, I wanna look at the 164. So, board member compensation, approved by the electors, so it's pursuant to state law, electors of the district at an annual or special district meeting have the authority to vote or authorize any or all of the following forms of compensation or reimbursement. Annual salaries for school board members, I wouldn't count it as salaries, I'd say stipends, or amount for each board meeting that you attend. Payment of actual and necessary expenses when traveling in the performance of duties. Reimbursement, whether full or partial, of a board member for actual loss of earnings. So that's, the electors can do that. They can modify or rescind that. I mean, and that's governed by law, so I clean up 164 to be more in alignment with, like, this is the legal piece of how you do it, versus ours, which was just, but this is just saying very publicly what the authority of the board is and how you engage publicly with that. And then I would talk about reimbursement following, again, district established rates, practices, and procedures, et cetera. I mean, because again, you're a high-functioning team, but I've seen other scenarios where they can be accused of giving themselves a raise, if that's what this one is protecting you from. And no one's becoming a board member for its compensation, trust me. But just in case.
No, I think what you outlined makes sense, to try to combine it that way. I'd like to see that.
Perfect, all right, so then I'm gonna drive the professional part, I'm gonna keep the piece on compensation, keep it to the legal, and knock that up. Any other, pieces around those concepts? What we have missing, and again, it's not required, but in most districts that I've been part of, part of our onboarding and our annual review as a board member team was talking about conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I see that.
So I included sample, that's based on WASB's. WASB's was a little wordier, but I remember in my last district, we kind of got to the core of it, just to talk about conflict of interest. So again, we have a policy 165 on board ethics. And I also linked, so there's the ethics piece, I linked a sample. Remember, you have WASB as a support agency for writing policy, or Neola. I included a district sample on the ethics, but kind of that whole concept of ethics and conflict of interest kind of felt connected to me and worthy of exploration.
We have a policy on, if I'm the principal, I can't be the boss of my nepotism. We have a nepotism policy
Correct,
somewhere.
that's separate. That would be in the 500 series that are around, yep.
Let me look at that one real quick.
But what everyone had to clean up a couple of years ago was paying board members for other roles. Yeah, specifically it was around board members being coaches. And also being a paid member of the organization, while the boss of the organization. So there was some of those pieces. And also you can see, there's some guiding principles, using the ethics one as some guiding principles of your practice. But then also conflicts.
So
Of interest seems separate to me.
So what this is saying is except perhaps for the coaches, any other employee of the district is largely ineligible to be on the school board. True?
Yeah, you would have some conflicts of interest, that goes beyond, you can't vote on anything that's impacting you.
Yeah. It says due to the legal doctrine of
Yeah.
incompatibility of office, no board
Correct.
member who is currently in office may simultaneously be employed by the district in any other capacity.
Yeah, and
There's the
that's-
exception for the coaches, but
Yeah, that's not just an us thing, that's
I just want
that's statute.
exactly, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Correct.
That's not just a West Bend thing, that's
Correct.
a law thing.
In the coaching piece of it, if I'm reading the Mapledale example correct, you have to be a volunteer coach.
Correct.
You can't receive a paycheck
As a board member.
as a board member
Mhm.
coaching a team.
Yep, good point.
I was jumping around a little bit, sorry. Are we looking at 165 or 165.1?
So we're, 165, there's board ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at that, and I gave you an alternate district sample, which is a Neola district, so you could see the nuance between what we have, because WASB did not have a specific sample in there, so I wanted to get you some sample language. That one's coming from Nicolay, who uses their services, so that's 165. But sometimes when you talk about ethical considerations, for me, that brings up that whole training that we would do with people on conflict of interest, so. sometimes you can get led that way when it could be its own standalone, that's what I'm saying. So 165, what would you like to see? What we have currently, any pieces in an alternate framework that are sparking interest that you want me to develop?
I guess I'd look for your recommendation on what we have versus the Neola example. Ours was written in 67 and really hasn't been revised since 2011. But seems pretty simple and
Anything that doesn't fit anymore for you as board members?
One item that I saw in the original that I thought, I mean, I thought the original was fine. I did like the more modern one a little bit more. There was a mention in the original, I think it's number, which one is it? Number 6. Board members should, to the best of the members' ability, accept and support board actions and decisions when a majority sustains them. So, in other words, I may have voted no, but the rest of the board voted yes, and therefore I'm going to support it. I thought that was something that would be important to preserve.
I agree.
And maybe it's big, maybe it's somewhere in the Neola version, but I didn't see it there.
So maybe take a look at that, update, but make sure I'm preserving, like you said, that piece, and marrying these two to bring our language up to date, but get us a nice foundation that, again, we can kind of use as something foundational that guides our work, whether we're veteran board members or no. Okay? And then with that, take a look at the 165.1. Again, WASB had a lot more language. I had pared that down significantly. But same concept. You know, or do we push the concept of that into 165 around how we're going to?
I was just gonna ask, if you wanted to consolidate policies, you could certainly put it into 165. If you think it needs to be standalone, I'm fine with that too, because it's short. So I'm indifferent on that.
Right. Or do you want me to try and tighten that up even more and get the concept embedded into 165?
Well, I think 165.1, the third paragraph, is more than just a concept. I think that clearly outlines that you cannot hold a job within the district while you're a school board member, a paying job.
And where does that, again, blend in, trend into the nepotism up in 500? Because, you know, I may not be the employee, but, you know, my immediate family member. And, you know, that's true, was Teresa's issue a few years ago.
Oh, sure, yeah. If your wife were to work here,
Right,
are you allowed to vote on her benefits package?
right,
Correct. That's why I jumped
Gotcha.
to the nepotism one
right,
a little bit
yeah.
ago.
This is just focused on the board member, but I would say board member and immediate family.
Okay, so I'll connect with WASB on how do we interplay those, because we are a really close and generational community, and that's not unheard of to have that interplay. So how do we do that, and does that come into conflict of interest when, I remember probably 15 years ago, there was some language in the district I was in at that time, and it was around limiting your authority on things that were gonna personally impact you, or of that nature, like where you were gonna gain somehow financially. It was around, and there's language in there, I look at Chris, Lily, around the office and gain in the office and that interplay. So I'll check with them on that and talk through that exact scenario, and does this cover it?
I don't mean to jump to the nepotism policy, but 5 years ago when I went to WASB training as a new board member, I asked Bob Butler or whoever was there about this
You didn't want it?
nepotism policy. And he said, oh, I heard you guys did that in West Bend, and, you know, I said, is that common to have that policy? And he said, I can tell you around the state it is not common, because you look at a small town like Campbellsport, for instance, you know, there's 7 people who serve on, it's a small town. I mean, there's no chance in the world that we're gonna get a school board member who doesn't have a family member who also works here. It's just, there's limited jobs in a small, you get what I'm saying.
Sure.
And so,
So I'll work with them, how to keep the opportunity open, but work within, so people aren't feeling that conflict of taking positions or votes on things that specifically financially impact you.
well, I'd go even further. I mean, if my spouse is an English teacher and we're voting on an English curriculum, is that a conflict of interest? That I'm voting on something that at home she hates, but the rest of the board we like, you know, whatever, so.
Well, remember, even if she at home hates it, the other one, Chris, where we said, protect this concept of, once the board votes, then you support
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah,
So-
yeah.
Right.
So I'm interested, I guess, you know, that was 5
Explore
years
that a little bit
ago.
more.
Interested to what WASB would say about
Mhm.
conflicts of interest and bringing in that nepotism. I'm not saying having a nepotism policy is bad at all, but if you do have a
Every
board
handbook
member.
contains something around that, but how do you?
And maybe, you know, immediate family is too broad of a statement, because if you have a child who, you know, an adult child who is employed in the district, you're not benefiting directly. If it's your spouse,
Right.
you are. So maybe that is the dividing line of,
And our nepotism policy does define,
Mhm.
family members shall be defined as a spouse, former spouse, designated partner, biological or adoptive child, parent, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law,
Everyone.
sibling, aunt, uncle, guardianship relationship, or financial dependent or codependent. And so, I mean, it covers a lot,
Everyone.
third cousin twice removed.
you know, yeah. So, anyway,
I will do that and then tell them kind of what we're thinking and the why, and have them help us put something together.
okay.
That's good. That's a good call.
Great. How are we doing? Anyone need a break?
I did.
I will eventually, I just.
I just keep eating chocolate.
That's really
Been
Drink
drinking
my
a lot
way
of
through.
water over here.
You're the chair, so you get to call it.
Oh, you
Whenever
need a break?
Whenever you, no,
Okay.
I say whenever you need it, you
All right.
can call it.
Okay.
Well, then I'm gonna keep going. 166 is board member electronic communications. And I think really that's orienting a board towards, one, you must do everything on our servers, our devices, our everything, because we archive and keep everything, and that it's all public. And that those, sometimes when you have people new to service like that, those are new concepts. So it's an advisement piece, it's a training tool, and it's a transparency piece for our public around that. This hasn't been touched in a while, so I also gave you the WASB language.
So I like the WASB breakdown. I think it's more complete. The one concept that I saw in the original version, if I remember, let me see if I have this right. In the original version, we talk about, we'll provide you with an email account, and we really, really encourage you to use it, because that way the district manages it, et cetera. If that concept could be wound into the WASB, I think that would be helpful. But I'd sit open to the other, my
And
colleagues' thoughts.
I like to, that the WASB was in attention to both the public records law
And the open meetings law, because those are two different things and part of your practice. So I can kind of import the other in.
I was going to say the original version kind of hinted at the walking quorum, whereas the WASB version goes at it in greater detail. And so I thought that was more explicit. I liked it.
Yeah, I think the WASB piece, again, more like that other policy from a educational for a first-time board member is very helpful, but, you know, in a policy, should you be posing these questions like on, you know, lines 38 to 44 and so forth. For me personally, the piece that kind of really hit home in terms of using district email account rather than my personal account was, if there is an open records request, and I've been emailing from my Yahoo account, suddenly my entire Yahoo account now needs to be opened up to Tim to go in and pull out what needs to be done. And again, that doesn't belong in policy, but in terms of educating new board members who are, well, I'd rather do this off my phone. You can do it off your phone, but use the district account.
I don't know what we're worried about. We log you in.
Yeah,
Joel's like, yeah.
we get, you know, a lot of us are on Facebook,
Mhm.
which is tough to address with, you know, Facebook can be certainly used in a good way for our constituents to communicate with us. But then as board members, we have to be so careful about what we put out there, because if you follow me and you know, two others, then we all of a sudden have a walking quorum on Facebook, and we know how Joel feels about something, and I used Facebook as an example when we were talking about whether or not we should go to 100% virtual days around the holidays. But I was very careful about what I put on Facebook. I was asking my constituents a question. I put out there, take a look at this proposal and feel free to let me know what you think. I did not say, I am in favor of this or I oppose this. I said, look at it and let me know what you think. I personally think that is okay, because I didn't say to my constituents on Facebook one way or the other. But some would argue that, well, did I create a walking quorum there if Paul is reading all kinds of comments under my Facebook section, maybe trying to sway vote? I don't know. I mean, Facebook is so difficult, and I think,
Why don't I do some more digging on social media, because it's silent here, and that, like you said, the nuance now of how to engage with people and try and get some, whether it lands in policy or not, but some clear direction and support for board members and how to navigate that. That sounds like that's needed too. So whether or not it belongs in policy or it's just a supplementary piece of here's how you do it.
At a minimum, I think as part of our continuing education, that might be a
Right.
useful piece.
Yeah, and, you know, thinking back to that other policy on what to do with complaints, and, you know, you can't go out and start your own ad hoc investigations.
Mhm.
What if I wanted to do a survey on Facebook of the community for my own benefit to go into something around a topic? And I would think that probably would be right up there that, you know, is that an investigation? I'm investigating the community's temperature for something.
Mhm.
here's another piece. Any current school board member running for reelection, you know, you're gonna wanna tell your constituents, here's what I got accomplished, here's what I wanna do with my next term, and we need to go after, you know, I don't know, more CTE, I don't know, whatever. I mean, you're trying to get reelected, and you may have a challenger who's not a current school board member who's able to say whatever the heck they want, but you've got to be careful
Because
about,
you're currently a board
because you're
member.
currently a board member.
Sometimes you have to slide outside of it and do a campaign one
Campaign
and those,
page.
yep, so.
I'd be curious,
I'll
I
get
guess,
some,
what
I'll get some
WASB,
guidance.
you know, maybe if your campaign page says Joel Under, for, it's a
Yep.
campaign page
It's-
versus
yeah, it's
I'm a
different.
current, anyway.
Yeah. So what I'm gonna do is play around and grab the district email use, get that more embedded into the WASB updated, more legal language. I'm gonna do investigation on social media, specifically where you're trying to solicit engagement or feedback from your constituents, and what does that look like? And then even too, I think the other concept that you brought up, maybe some more learning for the board on, is what do you do when you're in that weird position of running and currently sitting in a board when you have all these different rules that you have to be in attention to, and have they updated any guidance there? Anything else? Okay.
Do you remember the login to this?
I was gonna say, Mr.
Well, I'm sure not gonna say it out loud while on camera.
Oh, sorry.
I figured that out, I have the same issue.
You've just restarted. Well, why don't we take a quick
That was gonna be my-
restroom break and I'll pull that back up.
I'll fix all your
Thank you
computers
very
for
much.
you. As we close with the electronics.
Congrats on a moment.
It's
No,
all
wow.
software and then, okay, what do we do? Okay.
Same word.
Okay.
You're good?
So far, it sounds like it's gonna, yeah.
Two times.
That, okay.
That's your good, no?
Oh my gosh, okay, that I can almost even remember.
I like this group. We dig in.
Sorry?
I said, I like this group, we dig into.
Sounds good, is this?
We have all different,
In your general expectations?
oh yeah,
Good.
actually, we're very,
These are good discussions.
yeah, good thinkers and good questioners and able to dig in.
It's interesting how, in some cases, it's, 3 sentences is enough, and in other cases, it's,
Right,
well,
it's
we really
just
need to go
so,
step by step.
yeah, there's so much context.
No one else, anyone else need a quick bathroom
I
break?
did that right before the beginning.
All right, let's keep rolling.
All right, so that was the 160s. The next is the 170 series. That's around board meetings. So you can see the ones that we have in, but that's going through regular board meetings, special board meetings, closed sessions, board organizational meetings, so how those run. So this is where we had some of that on how you get elected, was in board organization, annual and special district meetings, and public hearings. So, take a look at 171, which is, regular board meetings. This felt like an area, instead of, as we were joking before, we have all these policies with a couple sentences, you know, can we talk about board meetings? And then maybe call out the different types of board meetings, because there are different types. And I just gave the exact, language, you know, do you want to do something so small, like here's a board meeting and you have to have one? Or do we want to do something, you can see nested, the opportunity to combine. I put in a sample where we had taken all the different WASB languages and different types of meetings and just said, okay, here's what a board meeting is, and here's what we're gonna do. Here's how we do the agendas, here's how you do minutes. Sometimes you have a special meeting, sometimes you have a closed session, and we just talked about the nuances of those. So it really goes to what the team would like to propose here. So the only obligation around a board meeting is that we are required to meet once a month.
I like the brevity of the Mapledale one. Stripping out all that other stuff about, except for holidays and so on and so forth. I mean, it's kind of a given.
Yeah, and we annually publicly put together the schedule of those, and so this is just giving you that legal language again. All we did was take the WASB language around those other areas and put it together. So that also too, when you talk about ease of use for a veteran, a new board member, members in the school district who are using it, or community who are trying to find it, if I wanna know about board meetings, don't have them go to 5 different places to find all the information to understand. Help get them the information that they need. So in favor of putting something together that talks about the nuances, the construction, the
Public notice.
yeah, that the board meets, the notice, the minutes, building the agenda, all of those things, and then the different types of board meetings.
And put it all in one.
Yep. Okay.
Agreed.
The only nuance there that I would recommend standalone, and I gave you sample WASB language, is the annual district meeting. Currently, at the meeting, we set the date. Right now, our policy says that we have one, and it's from 1967. It doesn't talk about how we set that in any way. So I gave you the WASB sample language, which is updated around holding your annual or special meeting of your electors. And then you can see I left in 2 options. So you can take a vote, like we could take a vote at this meeting, this next meeting, and say on this day, the electors authorize the district to determine the date and time. So I did that in my former district. And so that policy will say on, August, whatever, the electors voted and empowered you to set it. So then, a couple months leading up, we look at, do we have all the financials? Do we have this? Great, when are we setting that? You still have the obligation of notice, you still have all that. But right now, what we're currently doing is we're doing option 2. At the time of it, you're setting next year's meeting date. So you have the authority to go to the electors and ask their input and have you do it either way.
So the alternative would be we convene the electors a second time.
So at our next meeting that
Our-
we have with our electors coming up,
Okay, so
our next
in
annual
September.
meeting, we add this item on here
As an agenda item.
as part of the agenda, authorizing the board to set that meeting. And then we would set it annually.
At that point and thereafter.
Yep.
Yeah, and the reason I like that is because otherwise, and I think maybe you were hinting at this, Paul, let's say, fine, at the annual meeting, we ask the electors, we pick the date. And let's say we pick September 20th, I'm making that up. And then all of a sudden, we realize 4 months later that there's a big problem with September 20th. So we'd have to convene another special meeting of the electorate to move the meeting date from September 20th to somewhere else.
Correct.
I think if we as a board set that date to the best of our ability, far enough in advance, that's plenty of notice to the electorate. And if something unusual would come up after that, I think that flexibility of having the board be able to do it really makes a lot of sense.
And you can even put yourself to a little more heightened accountability on it. You can say, 2 months in advance. This, you can give yourself a longer advance time. You can do whatever. The intent is there. But like you said, you want to be responsive to what's going on in the community, to make sure we have all the financial, everything that we need to make sure the electorate is duly informed, that we've gone through everything we need to. And like you said, not going through now we have to convene you twice and, a hoop versus meaningful engagement.
Well, and maybe more so than realizing after the fact that we picked a bad date because of something going on in the community or whatever. Let's, take the whole pandemic thing that, okay, this date was set a year in advance and in the ensuing 330 days, something happens in the community that we're not able to hold that meeting. Well, in this current approach, we're bound by law to hold that meeting, and now we gotta do something to reconvene the electors and so forth.
Or we hold it and you just, you know you're setting up something that's, it's a competing engagement for our families and our community. And like you said, you know, we don't want to do that either.
Or you're waiting on financials from a state budget that's still not approved or whatever.
Which happens.
Yeah.
So would the idea be that each year at the annual meeting of the electors would approve granting to the board to set the next meeting?
They just have to set it once. They give you that authority one time until they take it away.
Okay.
So it's option one, line 16, 17, 18.
And
And we would bring it forward at an annual meeting. Hopefully it would be approved and then we'd never even have to bring it
So
back.
it would say, so that this policy would be revised and it would say, at the meeting held on September, you know, whatever our date is, the electors in this district authorize the board to set that date. Done.
Point forward.
And that just stays there. And then, if it doesn't work, you can put it back on the docket to remove that authority and go back to setting it then. You can do whatever.
And in reality, given that this year's meeting was set by the electors a year ago, how many people really remember what that date is?
Right.
And as you said, we're still bound by all of the standard notification timeframes and venues and so forth.
I make the recommendation for you to consider it, because I think it positions us to be more responsive and to leverage opportunities for engagement with your electors. And I know that's what you want, is to try and get more engagement. And so this positions you to be able to do that.
Well, ultimately, this topic that we're discussing, if we agree with it as a committee, the board agrees with it, the electors have to approve it. So it's
Absolutely.
not that, I mean, there's multiple steps of transparency here.
Correct.
I'm good with option one. I kind of like that.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah, and Andy and I talked about it from, you know, as we're prepping financials and from that perspective, you know, he's like, that makes sense operationally as well.
So is there a required time frame in which that meeting has to happen? We're doing it late September because then in October, we've got to approve the
You
levy.
gotta be ready for the levy, it's gotta yep.
So we're not in a situation where
You
the
can't put it off.
community reluctantly goes with option one and we start stonewalling and sliding into February, March, April of the next year.
So many of those timelines are grounded in statute and tax levies and, you know, community taxes coming back to the district, those kinds of things. It has to be in alignment there. And we get a time frame in which you can have it, and that's the only wiggle we have. This is just letting you do the specifics.
It is just after 6. Is everybody okay to keep pressing on here? Or
Through the list, yeah.
Well, I know.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm good, I'm good.
I
Thank you for
do
asking.
have a hard stop at about 6:30 or 6:35. I need to pick up my daughter at 6:45.
Press on for 25 more.
Okay.
She's probably happy you didn't make her come to the
No,
parade.
she's at dance, so, and mom's out of town, so I gotta
Tell her we're going back to the meeting.
pick her up. But let's keep pressing here.
All right.
Not too many left.
So that was the 170s. The 180s, you're almost there, are operating procedures. Rules of order, quorum, voting methods, board minutes, committees, advisory committees to the board, public participation, board member participation via technology, virtual board meetings for emergency situations, all of those fall under the 180s. So you can see what we have. We have a meeting conduct one. 181 is actually rules of order in the naming convention and gets at how you're functioning as a board. We follow Robert's Rules of Order, and this is just so stating that and how you go around that. So if you want to take a look at our current, which again, 1972, that would be the year of my birth. I guess I would urge you to take a look at the updated language provided by WASB.
I guess the question I've got with our current policy, paragraph 3, voting shall ordinarily be done by voice vote. Roll call vote must be honored upon the request of any board member. Doesn't say anything about when you've got a member attending remotely and having to do voice vote, which is in that.
We have that in the
subsequent
other policy, where it requires a roll call vote.
Yeah, it should say, must be honored, yada, yada,
I'd say-
unless governed by other policy or whatever, if we stick with our current verbiage.
So if we look at an update, you want to make sure it's in there that any board member at any time can ask for a roll call vote.
Yeah, I think, Paul, is what you're saying, something like roll call vote must be honored upon the request of any board member, or if another policy still requires.
Or governed by alternate policy or something along
Or
those
is
lines.
required by.
By policy.
Policies.
Yeah.
So take the updated language and make sure this concept carries forward in the new.
So that's 181.
Mm-hmm.
181.5 is virtual, it should be 188.
Yeah, it's labeled 181.5, but actually participating in a meeting via technology should be 188 in the WASB. So first and foremost, I'm saying that it needs to be renumbered.
But we have an existing 188, correct?
We have one on,
The high school configuration review?
yeah,
So that would need to be
that
renumbered?
didn't match, so I said, well, that's the wrong number. So we have 181.5. And then when I was looking at the language, there's a couple things. So there were several WASB pieces, but really they were getting at that, the board intends its business to be done in person, and we're honoring that there's times where you might be taken away, but technology provides you the ability and opportunity to still participate. And then our only nuance in there was that we go to a roll call vote during those. So this, I think everyone it's more than one in emergency situations around hosting your whole board meeting virtually. But this is just saying, like I said, there's 8 different pages of how you could write that.
Jeez.
Right, and I was like, you know what? And it just gets into around notice. The thing is, we hope that they're face-to-face. We have the technology and the ability. Please provide notice to the board president, superintendent, so we can make sure we're good to go. I think it's good practice, given the state of hearing and the ability that we go to the roll call vote in those situations. Chris, there's pieces in there that says you have to set out, like at the beginning, we say who's participating remotely.
Right.
Someone's not just lurking on a phone or on a computer somewhere. We say it at the beginning of the meeting. So I think that the pieces that we have in place now are are working and afford our members that ability to participate. So,
So, sorry, the existing policy, let's see, toward the end, paragraph 1. They're talking about participation shall only take place in accordance with all of the following provisions. So the first one is, while several days' notice is fully encouraged, notice must be given by at latest 12 noon on the day of the meeting to the president and superintendent, notifying them of the intention to participate via teleconference. So let me pause there. I think I understand go ahead.
you and I are on the same page. I don't necessarily in this day and age need that much notice, but you don't want someone
Doing
saying the
sneaky-
practice of at 5:15, hey, I gotta be remote.
Absolutely.
So maybe there's no guarantee that we'll be able to execute their electronic participation if notice falls later than noon,
Right. And I'm
but that
okay
it's
with
there. Because it just doesn't, we're wired that way now, so,
Well, the other piece is Tim's typically the one that's coordinating all this, so by establishing that noon cutoff, that gives him 5.5 hours, or, you know, the two of you 5.5 hours to get an email to him, it gets seen and.
Sure, yeah,
there's
so
just different chains, but I think there's a way to write it where it's like, hey, noon, anything after noon, we can't guarantee
guarantee.
that it would be set up.
Yeah, because right, in today's age, there could be something that happens at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and it was out of the person's control, and I think we'd rather have the benefit of them participating, but for an artificial 12 noon cutoff. But I agree, we don't want to put the district in a bind as it relates to making the arrangements. Let's see, there was another one.
I think that's
Oh.
perfect.
Yeah, and then the final sentence, the board president or superintendent shall then notify the other board members as soon as possible. While I'm not opposed to that, I guess my question is why?
I didn't see the reason for that one either, because we're publicly stating it. So as long as the two of us are prepared, ready to go, and we know that. And especially too, because emergency things come up.
That's the point.
And like, let them, if they can still participate, we want participation. Let's not do things that bar that.
Right,
And we're stating it at the meeting when someone's absent, that they have an excused absence or participating remote, and people are engaged that way. I think that's fine.
I have no issue striking that sentence.
Perfect.
Tommy was remote one of the last meetings and makes no never mind to me.
Yep.
Perfect. So yeah, other than, like I said, in the millions of pages of WASB, it's just, there was nothing earth-shattering in there either. I can send you all of these sets to look at, but they're, other than what was written.
and I think also, I'm assuming everyone on this panel has Zoomed and Teamed and conference called a heck of a lot over the last, we'll say, year plus. And there's good and there's bad, but with good practice, you can make virtual attendance work.
Then the next couple ones, those kind of read in that procedural bucket
Yes.
to me. So how could we, as we had with the others, kind of take the concept of procedures and, this is what a quorum is, and this is how we're gonna act, here, this is how voting goes, this is, those just seem like things that could be nested in one thing that explained key concepts around how it worked.
I'm fine with combining a lot of that
Yeah,
and using WASB language. It's all
okay,
pretty
good.
basic stuff to me.
Yeah.
Then with meetings, procedures, and
Meeting-
minutes, kind of the
Quorum.
same concepts,
Yeah,
right? I can put all that together.
I think so.
And that's just procedural,
Mhm.
procedures are about,
Yeah.
how do I vote? How do I do this?
Meeting
And
procedure.
And we're certainly not leaving it up to a new board member to read everything and untangle it. We're doing face-to-face orientation, hopefully if someone's coming out of the board, they've been attending meetings and invested, so they understand. But I think it's helpful for people to understand and have, like you said, some foundational pieces for procedure. So then what I will do is I will take all those concepts with the new language, tighten it up, so it's not so lengthy, and just give good foundation on those.
Good.
Procedural, okay,
Mhm.
perfect. 185 is one that merits a little bit of discussion, because it's our board committees. This one, recall last year, it's currently suspended. And we have 2 committees, so we have very, like, these are the committees you're gonna have, here's who's on them, here's this. I then put together some WASB sample language around, you know, what's a committee? And this goes to, well, what's a standing committee? What's an ad hoc committee? What's a task force? I'm like, what are the differences between all of these? And do you need separate policies on everything? Do we just need to say, like, how would we like to convey that?
I think having, if we're talking about the various types of committees, to have all of those under one heading, that I would just look at one spot for the various types of committee, standing, ad hoc, I think would be simpler.
And I think too, might we want to, instead of kind of carving this in stone, like 185 is carved in stone, and you'd have to sunset the whole policy, you know, suspend it right now, because it doesn't work. To me, is that best put when you're welcoming new board members or reaffirming veteran board members, and you're talking about committees and what we've had and what they think, and having some good dialogue so that you can be responsive. And then here's the framework for, you know, proposing a committee and who's on a committee, and it's the particulars there.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot, because otherwise, like in this case, if we said, you know what, we don't need I'm trying to remember what it was, maybe we don't need a facilities committee at this point in time, well then all of a sudden we either have to suspend the policy, we have to amend the policy in order to make that decision, and vice versa. If we decided, you know, we need a committee on, I'm not sure what it would be, you know, employee relations,
whatever.
making that up. And we can't do that until we go back and modify the policy, which requires, you know, multiple.
When we come out of our end of summer, kind of leading into fall, that vision for community conversations and engaging with people so that we're coming up with the iteration of the next continuous improvement plan, those themes, those things that we hear, you bet those are gonna be some ad hoc committees or task force, whatever you wanna call it. I think we're better served, like you said, that there's no magical date, like, here's the process by which the board will form a committee.
Like it.
And do that and just solidify those things.
So it's really left to the board's discretion of which committees are active, inactive, how they're spun up, how they're taken down.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I think
you can
that's
do it-
more.
Like I said, part of those spring conversations always, but then being responsive as things come up.
Yeah, that's
But
my
it's
point,
not getting
exactly,
away.
that we can be more responsive to the community's needs, more nimble this way. And I think that's important.
And again, currently our committees are curriculum and instruction through teaching and learning, and as well as policy. But I would envision, you know, as we engage in other conversations, that there'll be facilities that'll come back around as we update those plans, that kind of thing. So the language is around how to form a committee, and then there's also language around ad hoc or board work sessions. To me, I would rather leave this one around the different groups, and I would leave work session with a type of board meeting. You know, because that was, so you can have different structures in a board. You can have all these different committees, or you can have a committee of the whole and the board meeting. You can have special work sessions, which is different than a committee. So a lot of times, in a former role, I was responsible for all the enrollment redistricting. So we would form board committees on, you know, school closure, that would be a formal board committee. But then there were other ones where it was just a work session, where you're digging in deep on background information, and it strips away some of the constructs of the Robert's Rules of Orders and creates more of a presentation format. So just kind of talking that through, it seems like how to develop a committee, the ad hoc task force seems like one piece, and then the board, like a board work session, what that is, seems more a type of meeting that the board would have to push that over there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and that makes sense. There's kind of two, I like the way that you aligned them. Although they're related, they really are separate.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll utilize that updated language, and then you can look at it visually in those two formats. That takes us all the way through, we had, like I said, so those ad hocs, those different committees.
186.1 is redundant, if we're gonna go to.
Right, like I said, I'm gonna nest all committees,
That would be
Groups
my
under
recommendation,
one.
I would
yeah.
put.
Yeah.
So we kind of get rid of that, redesign one that honors all the different committees or process in which we might form one. The then next update is 187, public participation at a board meeting. And I just provided the updated language from WASB for your review.
That one, it seems like we've looked at over time. Let me scroll to the end.
2017 was the last time we looked at it.
I want to say we talked about this during COVID, about
Maybe.
public participation during virtual meetings and how
Yes.
we would handle
Oh,
that.
probably.
That's exactly right.
So although we didn't change the policy, I know we certainly talked about it at that point.
Yeah.
I personally like our public participation policy. WASB's is pretty general. I think the way ours reads
Mhm.
is quite a bit, I don't know, easier to understand and follow with the different headings we have in there.
Yeah, I like the formatting of ours. a lot
Formatting of
better.
ours, so I'm kind of fine with the way it is. I don't know that we need to make changes to it now at the end of a pandemic. We got through the pandemic and maybe it would need to be changed
Do you want me
100
to,
years from now at the next pandemic.
do you want to put anything in there specifically around virtual?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, I think we took a look at it, there was some concern, raised from the community that we wanted to be sure that whatever we were doing was not stifling individuals', ability to, and I think it had to do with whether or not we would open, in theory,
Yeah.
virtually, the ability to participate from people who we can't
Anywhere,
verify their
yeah.
identity, we're not really sure, and, can they speak on an agenda item, can they not? And so after feedback, we decided, we're just gonna kind of leave that alone and say, if you wanna publicly participate, you come to a meeting.
So 189, which we don't have, is a specific policy around, in an emergency situation, having to go to a virtual board meeting. I mean, and it would fit there. We don't have one. The only thing we had on that was around a board member's participation virtually, but we didn't talk about if the whole structure's gotta move to virtual platform. So, again, having navigated it, having done it, do you wanna leave it, or do you want to see something?
My opinion, and this is only mine, is I would leave it the way 187 is. In the event of another global pandemic where we can't all get together, maybe it would need to be looked at.
Yeah.
But I don't want to open up public participation to email the board president, he will read you your email. Or we'll buzz you in on the TV. I think if you want to participate in a board meeting, just like our board member responsibility policy says, we expect you to be here. And if you want to participate as a member of the community, then you need to be here. And fill out the card and turn it in and verify your identity and that sort of thing. You can obviously email board members or the superintendent at any time of day, and we always read those emails from constituents, but I like 187 the way it is.
Maybe we talk and throw a couple sentences around just exactly what you were saying. This also isn't the only time you have to wait to engage with board members.
Correct.
Here's some other ways, so maybe a couple intro sentences around, that's who we strive to be as a board, is to be accessible and all that. So here's a manner in which you can publicly address the full board, or here's how you can contact,
Yeah.
those are two different things. So I'll play around with, and sometimes we have that in There's a couple districts that have it like as a pamphlet, like, oh, I want to participate in the board meeting, what does that look like? And it's got a little bit intro. Let me grab one of those as a sample and see, like, do you want to put a couple lead sentences there? You good with that? But then what I'm hearing is, you know what, we don't need a whole policy on moving the whole platform virtual. We did good, we're fine. If we have to deal with it again, we will. So I don't really need to deal with 189.
Okay.
All right. 188, your favorite, which Joel won't have time to get into, is, it's the wrong number, clearly. 188 is board member participation in meetings via technology. We'd have to come up with, I'd recommend we renumber minimally, but it's around high school configuration review process is really what.
Well, if we're gonna keep that policy, it definitely needs to be renumbered. 'cause
Right,
we're gonna
so we would do
put
that.
Something else there.
And I believe that goes, do you want me to align it? To me, that's a procedural piece with the board. It would go up in that series around your operations. Because it talks about getting people together and getting feedback and all those, but it doesn't specifically say, it's got task force in it. Do you want me to line it up to a task force? I could go either way on where I stick the numbering. So types of committees,
Wouldn't go under 900 facilities?
That's a good point.
you could, but you're specifically in this policy calling for a task force to be developed and bring forward a formal recommendation.
So here's my recommendation on this. I don't care where you put it, but put it somewhere, number-wise. But as a committee, policy committee, I think we need to take a hard look at this policy. Yeah, either delete it or heavily revise it, because the way it reads on if we ever want to combine our high schools, I mean, it's like a 10-month process, and it has to, be
Every 2 years.
and it can't happen on certain years unless there's a governor or a presidential election and things like that. And I don't need to get into it tonight.
Nope.
I
So
just,
this
it
will be a
needs-
fun one for the next
either
conversation.
needs an overhaul or something. And so for now, I would say just move it so that we can put the real 188 where it needs to be. And I don't care where you move it to, but that's probably gonna be a discussion for a
Yeah.
committee meeting.
No, I agree with your recommendation. Let's find a placeholder for it, and then, since we're kind of drawing to the close of this meeting, we want to dedicate adequate time to discussion. I agree, Joel, with the approach.
Then I'm going to say from this one forward, we kind of carry forward to a next committee. I'll bring forward all those pieces. So if we can, just before we leave or whatever, compare some calendars. Because if we could reconvene, I can have all this work and we can have a second conversation prior to the 26th, which is the next board meeting. Because there's a lot of these pieces we are comfortable with bringing forward already.
Let's look at 190 quick, because I see that, I read it, and I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, I didn't,
We recognize people all the time in front of the board, and I've never, ever heard of a commendation that's been given. I don't know when you'd ever do that.
it originated in 1973.
Yeah. And if you truly wanted to give a commendation to somebody, you did, or any other board member did, then we'd just talk about it and do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, we have to have a policy on
Sound good?
I agree.
Every bit as quick, I think outside employment belongs in a staff handbook and not policy.
it. Sounds good.
And really, the next couple ones were updated recently. They're in alignment with the most recent WASB language. I've got them there, the one on board superintendent relations and the administrative staff evaluations. Those were fine.
Good. They're good.
Great. Thank you for all of the hard work and prep that comes into these meetings, and thank the board, the committee, for the time, because we spend 2.5 hours here, but we are going through a lot of stuff that's great to get updated and revised, and And I know there's more work behind combining and rewording some things,
That's
but,
okay.
you know, it'll be great to get all of these done.
Absolutely, and be able to at least say that we've looked at them, we touched them, and I echo Joel's thanks, especially for the work yet to come, because obviously all these tweaks that we talked about, moving things around, and that's work as well, so thank you for that.
Are you just recognizing our team, or are you commending us?
All
I was just checking.
I move to adjourn.
right.
Adjourning?
Adjourning, we all
Second, agreed,
all
to
right.
adjourn, yes.
In favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye,
Great, thanks for the good meeting.
right.